All right, so we're in the home stretch now. Just talking about the interpreting and evaluating section. There's 3 dot points here. I'm going to leave the conclusion to a little bit later. Firstly, justified discussion of the reliability and validity of the experimental process. So if we contrast that to up here, this one was about the evidence, limitations of the evidence. So that's about our data. Now this one really is about reliability and validity of our methodology, of our experimental process. They kind of inform each other because if you've got a poor, uncontrolled experimental process, then you're going to have larger uncertainty. All right, so let's have a look at what we can do for justified discussions of reliability and validity. The critical part here is justified. All right, so what does justified mean? It means, it means you need to explain why. Okay, so let's have a look here. What I've done is for the sources of error, I've just made just a basic statement here, just saying, look, there was uncertainty, which indicates that there must have been sources of error, which are outlined below. Then sources of error affecting validity. Now, what's validity? Validity is whether you measured what you said you were going to measure. In other words, it's any sources of error related to the independent variable. So, for example, if temperature was your independent variable and the temperature from the start and the finish of your experiment decreased, well, that's a problem of validity because you didn't measure what you said you were going to measure. If your independent variable is pH and it was meant to be pH 7, but in reality it was pH 6, well, that affects your validity. So I've got 3 points here about validity, and I have tried to justify it by saying what the effect on validity was. A larger sample size also is helpful for improving reliability. But anyway, my point here is that you need to explain what the issue was and explain how it affected validity. Reliability is whether you get the same results repeatedly. So the sources of error here are random errors, random uncontrolled errors that didn't necessarily affect the independent variable, but they arose in some of the trials, and that gives you a larger variation in your data and uncertainty. So again, you need to justify why. So this reduces reliability because, so again, I've got 3 supporting reliability. Look, I want you to be specific in terms of what the error was and where it occurred and what effect that had on your on what you measured on your dependent variable, and really justify it. It's far better to have something specific than have a shopping list of different things that may or may not have happened. All right, now once you have done your sources of error, the next thing you need to do is improvements and extensions. So let's just have a look here. Suggested improvements and extensions that are logically derived from the analysis of the evidence. So in other words, we need to link them to our sources of error. So I've put in a table here where I've got the source of error affecting validity, then reliability. Just ever so briefly just made a statement about what the issue was. And then you're going to talk about how you're going to improve that. Okay, be specific about how you're going to improve it. So maybe a sentence for each. Try and be detailed as you can. Okay, but you've got to address every one of your sources of error. Okay, a nice way to do that is in a table. Your extensions are then, so I guess improvements are those things that you're going to improve your experimental methodology by addressing those sources of error. Whereas your extensions are taking the experiment further. So looking at a different independent variable, perhaps looking at a different dependent variable, but certainly a different independent variable. And, justify why you would do that. So you might have some references, or it might link with what you did. But, they need to go further than just improving the experiment. So it's not just about doing different temperatures if your independent variable is already temperature, it's looking at a different independent variable, looking at something entirely different. Maybe, if you're doing enzymes, you might do a different enzyme or a different source of the enzyme, that sort of thing. But why is that important? Why would you want to do that? All right, the last part is justified conclusion that's linked to your research question. So 2 things here. You've got to state your research question, and you've got to answer your research question by providing some of the data. So that's how we justified our conclusion, is by using the data. So let's have a look here. I said the research question was, and then I have restated that most important data. So this really excellent summary we wrote here, that is exactly what I used. Okay, because that is the data we need to use to answer the research question. Okay, state the research question and then put in that summary and then tell me what it means. So this suggests that, maybe linking it to the science that you discussed in your rationale. If you're expecting to find a statistically significant result but you didn't, then you make a note about what your sources of error were that may well have affected that, or lack of sample size, that sort of thing. Finally, we've got our reference list. It's in alphabetical order. It's APA, and you can use this as a template to check. And then finally, I've got my raw data here. So that takes us to the end of your student experiment. Can I just ask that before you make sure you put in a full draft to your teacher, make sure you respond to that feedback, make sure that you ask for help, make sure that you get somebody else to read your report, because you're probably in love with your words, and it might be helpful for somebody else to identify something that doesn't make sense, or errors or something. Sometimes you can actually get it read back to you. So if you go into Immersive Reader, you can get it to read it back to you, so you can actually have a listen to your work.
Rationale. There has been a steady increase in the use of video-based instruction as a key.
Okay, so you listen to it and you might identify something that, that didn't sound quite right, that sort of thing. Okay, good luck.